All right, good afternoon and welcome to another webinar. My name is Selena Dorme. I'm with the First Nations Public Service Secretariat. I'm the engagement coordinator here, and I'm also from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation here in North Vancouver, but I am calling you from our West Vancouver offices on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Happy Friday. I hope you're all doing very wonderful today. I'm looking forward to wrapping up this afternoon and maybe starting my weekend early. You are currently here because you have wanted to find out some more information about the Indigenous Community Support Fund 2. So this is a technical webinar with our ISC folks and some of our FNHA folks here on the line that are going to share more information on what that process looks like. But before we get started, I want to call on Vern to start us off with a prayer. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Vern. Vern, if you could take yourself off mute. There we go.
Okay. Sorry.
Go ahead and get started. We're ready when you are. Vern, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can go ahead and get started.
I would like to ask that everyone remain seated, but if you're wearing a hat, please remove it for the moment. If you're comfortable, please shut your eyes and reflect on the words being said. Creator, we thank you for this opportunity to come together to discuss a very important topic that has affected us all and our communities. The pandemic has brought out the best in some of us, but it has also brought out the worst. We have lost people we love, and we have not hugged other loved ones for what seems like a very long time. We ask for patience and understanding so that we may take what we learn today and apply it for the benefit of elders, youth, and all community members. What we discuss will affect thousands and thousands of people within our bubbles. So we ask that decisions be made wisely. Hachkasiam.
I'm on mute. I'm the host. I'm supposed to know that I'm on mute. Thank you so much for opening up this webinar in a good way. Again, I'd like to just reiterate some instructions so that you can contribute to this discussion today. In order to submit your questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Everybody can see your questions. They can upvote your questions if you think it's a really good one. You can also submit your questions into the group chat. If you post them to our panelists, you can post them to everybody so that everybody can see them. And you can also raise your hand. So if you click on the participants list at the bottom of your screen, you can see everybody who's in the webinar, and you can use that blue little hand. There's a row of icons at the bottom of that dialog box, and that will let us know that you want to ask your question live. We will unmute you and you can ask your question live to, oh, good to see you, Vern. And you can ask your question live once we call upon you. So I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Jody Caden with Indigenous Services Canada.
Thank you so much, Selena. Thank you very much for starting us off in a good way, Vern. That was great. Felt very good. Thank you. So welcome to today's technical session, everybody, on the recent launch of the request for applications for funding through the Indigenous Community Support Fund. I'm Jody Caden, Director of Funding Services at Indigenous Services Canada, and I'm pleased to start today's session. Before we begin, on behalf of myself and my colleagues, we'd like to acknowledge the land of the Coast Salish speaking peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations that we have the pleasure to work from. And I'd also like to let you know that a number of my colleagues from the executive leadership team are here, as well as their staff, and we want to try and answer as many questions as possible today. We're also very pleased to have our partners from the First Nation Health Authority here as well to support our technical discussion from a health perspective. Katie Hughes is the Vice President of Public Health Response with responsibility for COVID-19, opioids, and emergency management. And Emily Dickin is the Director of Emergency Management, and they've joined us today. We want to make today's session very practical and provide you with information that will help you make a successful application to access funding through the needs-based component of the Indigenous Community Support Fund. Most of our time today will be spent walking through the application form, identifying the type and level of information that we're looking for in the applications, including the assessment considerations. As well, we'll provide examples of the kinds of activities that can be supported. There'll also be plenty of time for questions and answers. Now, before we get started, I want to provide a bit of context for those of you that may not be as familiar with the Indigenous Community Support Fund. It can be complicated, not as complicated as the US election, but it can be complicated. This fund was created by the Government of Canada this past March as part of our COVID-19 pandemic response. In August, a lot of additional funding was announced for the Indigenous Community Support Fund to continue to support communities in preventing and controlling the spread of COVID-19. To date in BC, we've already provided $65.2 million directly to communities and Indigenous organizations through funding agreement amendments. In August, it was announced that some of the Indigenous community support funding would be available through an application process for those communities that still require additional funding support to address their COVID-19 needs. This is the process that we're describing to you today. Now, before we dive into the details, it may be helpful to describe the other supports that are available or already implemented in your community. In addition to the Indigenous Community Support Fund, there have been funding increases in several program areas to support community needs over the last several months, such as education, income assistance, and community infrastructure for minor capital projects. The Indigenous Community Support Fund complements these other funding supports and better positions communities to respond to COVID-19. And I'm raising this here to alert you to the fact that there's a new minor capital funding allocation that will be transferred to your communities through an amendment to your funding agreement within this week. This minor capital funding is separate from this Indigenous Community Support Fund application process, and it's for building retrofits for band offices and other community buildings. Now, turning our attention to the purpose of today, to begin with, we wanted to highlight that your Indigenous Community Support Fund applications must demonstrate that the planned activities will directly address a COVID-19 related need in your community. For example, funding could be used to support food security for vulnerable community members, supports for those who need to self-isolate, for example, alternative accommodations, perimeter security on reserve, or minor adaptations for buildings, such as plexiglass. Although the application process closes November 30th, we encourage you to submit your application as soon as you can, because we will be reviewing applications as they are received. Funding will be in all communities by December 31st, and the activities that this funding supports can continue to March 31st of 2021. Now, just a few logistical reminders before I turn it over to our technical experts, Duncan Stephen, the Manager of Emergency Management, and Vern Bob, Funding Services Officer, who are going to walk us through the application form. We realize that you likely have questions during the presentation. You may have some already, which is great. So that's why this session is here today. And as Selena mentioned earlier, we encourage you to use the Q&A function on your screen to ask the questions. And once we're done, we're going to dedicate the rest of the time to answering your questions to the best of our ability. For questions that we can't answer today, we do commit to getting back to our folks, to all of you, as soon as we're able to, and we're aiming for no more than 48 hours as a service standard. If you have further questions after today's discussion, please send them directly to the ISC BC Regional Office at the ISC BC COVID-19 mailbox so that we can get right back to you right away. We're going to post that, the link to that mailbox in the chat. And we're also developing a frequently asked questions and answers document that will incorporate the questions we hear from you today. And we're committed to turning that around and getting it back out to all of you early next week. We're aiming for Tuesday. And we'll also include this FAQ in our regular updates that are sent out to all of you and posted on the First Nation Public Service Secretariat website. Okay, Duncan and Vern, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jody, for that brief introduction. And Duncan, thanks for sharing your screen. We'll go ahead and hand it over to, let's ask Vern to start this video again, too, as well.
Okay, hoping you can hear me. I'm not quite sure on this, but the easiest place to find the application is going to be on the First Nation Public Service Secretariat's website. We can follow the link in. It's listed under New Documents. And when you click that link, it's going to take you to this page. Now, as we scroll down this page, it's pretty self-explanatory. It talks about the process. It outlines much of what Jody had indicated in the brief overview. It talks about who can apply, and again, the deadline, November 30th. I'm going to encourage individuals, if they have their proposal ready before the 30th, though, to submit it in, because we really are on a tight time frame to review. And it's not necessarily a first come, first funded type of process, but I'll get into a little more of the details as we scroll down. When we get down towards the bottom of this page, we'll note that there are criteria involved for the proposals. And just under the selection criteria, we'll see some examples of applications that your community may consider. It's not going to be the be-all and end-all, but once we head up, we'll go back into the PDF right now. We note that there are instructions to go along with it there, and there is a wonderful template which is coming up right now. In the very top right-hand corner, we see PAW, then it gives a bit of a number, and then 2021, 2022. That is next fiscal year. But please be assured that if your proposal does come in, we will be reviewing it. It's just the wrong fiscal year at the top of the page. The privacy statement, you can read at your leisure. It's pretty standard. It's on most of our proposal forms. The identification, just going to emphasize a couple of areas on this proposal. And as a recipient, the recipient really does need to be a First Nation or an incorporated entity providing services to on-reserve, off-reserve folks. So yes, tribal councils are eligible. I saw that pop up as a question a little while back. Now, just to the right of the recipient name, we see a recipient number. If your organization has been funded in the past, you would have received a recipient number as part of the funding agreement. If your organization has not been funded in the past, that's still all right. We'll review the proposals, but prior to sending out a funding agreement, there's some supporting documentation that ISC representatives would be reaching out to you for. That would be a certificate of good standing, confirmation of your board, and signature specimens. Now, as we scroll down, we look at the contact name, and again, that's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to skip toward the application information. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. Now, when we look at the proposal summary, this is where I'm going to emphasize what you put down. We need to outline the risk. And what that would be is how the proposal addresses urgent, immediate needs for responding to an outbreak or containment efforts. We outline the readiness, which is the obstacles to starting the project, outlining staff, resources available. Is this a new project, or is it the continuation of a prior project? When we outline human impact, we'll be describing how many individuals are impacted by these activities. Are they elders, youth, homeless, members? And your definition description of it would provide details on how the most vulnerable would be prioritized and addressed, and really come down to what the direct benefit is going to be. That takes us down to the activities box. Now, these are all pretty broad ranging topics, and they're listed here because they were the primary topics that were raised in the first time around on the Indigenous Community Support Fund 1. You'll note infrastructure is listed down here. That doesn't mean submission of a project for a road, but it would be more along the lines of infrastructure required in a COVID atmosphere. And I just want to emphasize that any infrastructure projects are going to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. The activities are broad, as the Indigenous Community Support Fund is designed to be very flexible. In short, if you have a need that is COVID related, I would really invite you to submit a project. There are multiple applications are also welcome. If we look at the list of activities and you decide that you want to do more than one, please feel free. Submit as many as your community needs, and funding for it, well, it's going to be based on the number of proposals received as well as the availability of funds. The last question on this page relates to a pandemic plan, whether or not it's in place. That one's a simple yes or no. And with that, I apologize for losing my voice, but I'm going to throw it over to Duncan to finish off the rest of the page. Thank you.
Thanks, Vern. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm going to walk us through the second page of the application form. And one of the things I also just want to point out is, as Vern's indicated, the Indigenous Community Support Fund is intended to be both flexible and fairly broad in terms of the range of activities that can be supported. On the website, and the link, I know, Selena, thanks for posting the link there for the call for applications. On the website, at the very bottom of the call for applications, the terms and conditions for the various programs that are kind of bundled into the Indigenous Community Support Fund are included, and that's a really good reference in terms of additional information on eligible costs. On the second page of the form, you'll see the budget summary, and that's pretty straightforward. I think the critical thing there is that we are looking for costs to be broken down according to proposed activities. So as Vern has indicated, you might choose to put in multiple applications, each of them covering a focused or specific activity, or you might choose to bundle those up into one application form. However it works best for you, but it's very helpful for us if the costs here can be broken down according to the proposed activities. And then the other piece in here that's really important is just to indicate a priority ranking. So you'll see the third box I think under the budget summary there says priority, 1 being the highest priority and so on. And the intent there is that we want to make sure that those things that are the top priority for your community are supported. Obviously, we want to support as much as possible through this process, but if only partial funding is available at some point, we do want to make sure that those top priorities are addressed wherever possible. I'll point out the add a row button on the fillable form. You can add rows in order to expand the budget to capture all of the items you want to include there. In terms of partners, the next section again is fairly straightforward. Partners for your proposal aren't necessarily required, but if you do have partners you're working with, you're welcome to list them here. And the one critical piece there is if funding is going to be transferred or distributed to a partner or a third party, the allocation method needs to be identified. That could be in the project summary up above on page 1, or that could be even in the email that accompanies the submission, however best, but that information is very helpful. Under other government funding, this is where you can indicate whether you have received or requested any additional funds, either federally, provincially, municipally, or otherwise, to address the needs identified. And you can also indicate whether the outcome is known or what funding has been received. And again, you know, there's recognition that communities have received allocations under the Indigenous Community Support Fund, and those will be helpful in addressing some of the priorities, but the intent here is being if there are additional pressures or priorities to respond to COVID, that this mechanism is available for those. We have tried to streamline the application process, so it does mention supporting documents down below there. Supporting documents are not a requirement, and we're not asking that communities spend time preparing detailed proposals or desktop publishing anything. That's not necessary. We recognize that everybody's time is very precious. And so if you have existing supporting documents that you wish to include, and it might be something indicating support from a partner you will be working with, it might be a communicable disease or emergency plan if that's relevant and available, or it might be in some cases survey results if communities have surveyed their members in order to assess priorities and needs. Again, this is optional, and if you have that information to share, that's wonderful, but it is not a requirement. And at the very, very bottom of the application form there, we've got the declaration. So this will just need to be completed by someone who is authorized on behalf of the community or organization. And one thing to keep in mind there is that we may need to come back if there's pieces that we need to clarify and reach out to the contact listed on page 1 or the individual who's completed the declaration if there are any follow-up questions. We are trying to make this process, as I mentioned, as streamlined as possible. So we will keep questions to what is essential in order for us to be able to move applications successfully through our system. So that is the application form. I've got a few other comments that I just want to share. I'll just put my video on there. There I am. It worked. So just to recap, the applications for the needs-based process will be accepted up to and including November 30th of this month. Again, as Vern mentioned, and I think Jody may have mentioned as well, you're not required to wait until November 30th to submit your application. We really do want to respond to applications and move them through the process as quickly as possible so that those resources can support the work in your communities. They will be assessed for eligibility and prioritized on a case-by-case basis. And Vern did mention the criteria. Those criteria are listed, the human impact and the readiness and et cetera are listed on the website there where the call for applications is posted. And so it'll be important to refer back to those as you're preparing the project summary. Perimeter security was mentioned as an eligible cost, and what we're intending to do is to adopt the approach that the First Nations Health Authority developed for consistency. So just as a reminder, that speaks to eligible costs for personnel at 24.66 per hour and up to 48 billable hours per day, plus eligible operating costs. And we can share, I'll post the link shortly in the chat, just in terms of the approach that's been adopted for that. While we do have an opportunity for questions here today, you are also welcome to submit questions to the ISBC Region COVID email address at any time. And this is also the same email address where applications can be submitted when they're ready. And with that, we will try to respond to questions as quickly as possible. Jody mentioned the speed of service and the standard there, just so that we can get information back to you in order to support completion of applications as quickly as possible and getting those into our system. I think one other piece I just want to mention is that we're of course working very, very closely with the First Nations Health Authority as a partner, and really grateful for their presence here to support this dialogue. The one other piece is that health-related requests can continue to be eligible as under the community supports guide that the FNHA has shared with all communities. And if we do receive health requests through our system, through this Indigenous Community Support Fund needs-based process, we will work with the FNHA to sort out the best mechanism. So if it can be supported under the Indigenous Community Support Fund needs-based process, that'll be routed through our system. But if there is something that is strictly a health or a health service need, we will work with the First Nations Health Authority to ensure that that things are routed appropriately, and so communities don't have to worry about how to navigate between the two systems. We'll work very closely together on that. So with that, I think we've covered off the application form and broadly speaking the process. And I know there's probably a lot of questions, and we do want to leave a lot of time for those questions. So with that, maybe I'll turn it back and we can look at our Q&A.
Thank you so much for going over the application. We do have a number of questions in the queue and also in the group chat. Some of our questions have been answered by our panelists, which was the ISC executive team behind the scenes kind of answering your questions. So most of the questions in the group chat have been answered. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the questions in the queue. And I'm going to start with the first question. Would a COVID isolation house meet the infrastructure criteria? So I'm going to ask any of our panelists to go ahead and turn on their video or their audio if they wish to answer the question, or maybe it's you, Stephen.
And I could probably start with an answer, and I'll look to our infrastructure colleagues maybe to help with that one if there's any clarification needed. The intent of this funding is really around minor capital and infrastructure adaptations that may be required, and not necessarily acquisition of major capital or anything like that. That said, every circumstance is different, so I think if there's a need, we would ask that that be submitted to us, and we can work that through our system and try to find the best way to respond to that. And again, we do work really closely with the First Nations Health Authority around the work that they do to support isolation planning and other work related to that need as well.
Thank you so much. Any of our other panelists wanted to add to that question or comment?
Thanks. It's Emily Dickin here from First Nations Health Authority. And I think in terms of like harmonizing that support from ISC, there's also the ability to support through FNHA sources of eligibility to enhance community isolation spaces, and really working through our regional teams to have those conversations, see whether it's retrofitting spaces, whether it's looking at temporary spaces, or how we connect into the community cohorts through the regional health authorities as well. So really making that collective isolation plan. And so happy to kind of reconnect in that space and bring our regional team into that conversation as well.
Thank you so much, Emily. Much appreciated. The next question is there a link for more information on the minor capital funding for building retrofits? Can that be found somewhere else?
Hi, it's Paula. We're in the process of sending out an update. There will be update number 65 sent to communities. We're aiming for Monday with additional information about the minor capital allocations for buildings. It includes buildings like the band offices, other community buildings, daycares, fire halls, those types of facilities. And an allocation will be going out through an amendment to your funding agreement today or Monday. And yeah, their update will provide additional information on Monday as well. So that should provide some additional details for communities.
Thank you so much, Paula. The next question is, our band is under block funding. It's under a block funding agreement with the Tribal Council. Can our band submit this application directly, or does the Tribal Council have to apply on our behalf? Jody, it says that you wanted to answer this question live.
Could you,
You need,
can you, my video?
let's see. Okay. There we go.
Great. Hi, everybody. So what would work best for us, and this relates to another question that I saw about various programs, thinking of submitting separate applications, like one from education, one from social development, or that kind of thing. It would be much easier for us if all of the community needs are identified in one proposal, or if you have several proposals that they speak to each other, because maybe you need to, you feel like describing each issue in one form works best for you. Just let us know that there is more than one so that we can gather them together and see the overall request. And I would say, with respect to your block arrangement with your tribal council, that communicating with your tribal council and determining whether or not they are submitting an application that includes your needs would also be really helpful. And if you can communicate that to us on the application form, then that just helps us be more effective and be able to make a decision and not have to circle around and get those answers to those questions ourselves. I hope that was clear.
Thank you, Jody, very much. The next question was, where can we find out if our administration has applied for this funding in the past?
Yeah, and I'll take that one too. Thanks, Selena. So every community should have received already an email that includes a summary of all of the funding that you've received for COVID-19. Period. All of the funding that you've received. And it's an accurate and up-to-date snapshot, and emails were sent out by all the FSOs to their contacts last night. So that's how you will find out what funding you've received in the past.
Thank you so much. I do want to also just make everyone aware, again, aside from the Q&A option, you can raise your hand to ask your question live to any of our panelists, and you can find that little blue icon at the bottom of your participants list. Jeremiah wants to ask a question live, so I'll go ahead and I'll turn on your audio to go ahead and ask your next question. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for putting on this webinar. I had a question about the type of proposal that will go forward. Kind of depends on how long-term we're looking. So if we can expect that ISC would come to the table with another set of funding within a year, the proposal that I would put would only go for a year. But if we don't know, or you're saying it's never coming again, the type of proposal you're going to get from me is something that's going to be very substantial. And it's something that's going to last a lifetime for the needs of the community. Just for quickly, food security. As an isolated First Nation, we were hit very hard by food shortages in Prince George and Terrace, right? So when I put forward an submission, it's going to be looking long-term, between 4 to 5 years at least. Now I'm imagining you guys are going to get some sticker shock there, but for the most part, that's a realistic issue for an isolated community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah, and I believe Jody is going to respond to that.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to start responding, and there are probably some others would like to add. We'll see how I do. Jeremiah, great question. I really appreciate you being open and honest about that. We fully understand that these are not, that the need is ongoing, and that the need is going to be ongoing for quite some time. This call out is targeted, and it is specific in time. The authority that allows us to fund this actually expires at the end of December. So we have to get the money out from this fund before the end of December, and we've got that all in place to do that. It's to fund activities up until the end of this March. So we recognize that all communities have needs that go beyond this December and this March. This is not meant to try and address all of those. It's just for this period of time. That's kind of the foreseeable future. I cannot tell you with any great clarity whether or not more funding will be forthcoming. However, I think we've seen that the government of Canada is very intent on prioritizing support for Indigenous peoples. So I'm going to stop there and see what others have to offer.
It's Duncan here, and Jeremiah, great to hear your voice, and I would echo everything that Jody said. The only other thing I would say is it's possible that there could be some short-term activities within that window of eligibility that could have an ongoing legacy. And I think too, you know, I've heard some discussion of community gardens and sort of getting things in place to be ready for spring as one option that some communities are thinking about. There might be other options that kind of have a legacy beyond the funding eligibility period up to March 31st. But yeah, I would echo everything that Jody shared.
Thank you both so much. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next question. But again, if you want to raise your hand, the blue icon, the raise hand icon is at the bottom of the participants list. If you click that participants button at the bottom of your screen. There were a few questions that were asking if there was a PowerPoint specifically available explaining the way that you went through the application process. There is not one specifically for this webinar, but it was requested by several other people. So perhaps that could be made available. The other was the format of the application, and some folks are having some trouble opening it with the format that is downloadable from the website. So maybe anybody can address two of those issues.
And maybe I'll just jump in on the application form. I think if anyone's having trouble accessing the application form off our website, I think the best approach would be just to email our BC Region COVID email address, which Selena has shared. And we can send a copy to you, and that's worked where people have run into some difficulties. So hopefully that will work for you as well. The PowerPoint, we don't have a presentation to offer right at the moment, but Vern did speak to the instructions that are available. So where the PDF forms are posted on the website, there's a third document, which is the instructions, and it actually walks through the application form section by section with a lot of what we've shared today.
Thank you both so much for clarifying that. Carolyn Gladstone would like to ask a question live. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Carolyn. Carolyn, can you unmute your, there we go.
Can we make capital purchases? We were talking about our garden. We've got a large garden area that we want to develop. We have developed it before, but we need some tools.
Paula, I would say to link the capital purchase, the request as closely as you can to COVID, to reducing the risk of COVID transmission or reducing the likelihood of COVID. The infrastructure category is more directed towards buildings. It doesn't mean that other things won't be considered, but you, in terms of your application and making the case for restarting your garden, maybe it's more related to food security versus infrastructure. So really just look at the categories and determine where where it best fits, but also if you make the case that it's, you know, really required for your community's food security, then that's something definitely we'll consider as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, for your question. The next question is, we have a number of residents who are non-band members and non-status. Can we include them in this application?
The Indigenous Community Support Fund bundles up a number of terms and conditions, including the terms and conditions of the Emergency Management Assistance Program. And those terms and conditions are actually specific to the community, not individual membership. So, you know, if there's individuals who ordinarily reside on reserve and irrespective of their membership or anything like that, absolutely they could be included in the needs-based process. And then I know there's a number of questions around the urban and off reserve. So, you know, I think similarly it's for the community to determine the services that they're able to provide and who within the community needs that support. And I know we'll be doing a separate session on the urban and off reserve piece, but there's a fair amount of flexibility definitely within the emergency management term conditions for the on reserve, and then some flexibility with those who would be within kind of that urban and off reserve envelope, for lack of a better word.
Thank you so much. The next question is, what level of detail are you looking for in the proposal summary section? Is it correct that it's only the application, that it's the only application form, plus any optional supporting documentation that is required? Vern, you'd have to unmute, or we can't hear you. There we go.
Okay.
Oh, you just muted yourself. Unmute, you have to unmute again.
Okay.
Now
So
we can hear you.
I'm kind of working off two buttons here. Sorry about that. I would suggest one of the things that we're looking for is go heavy on the clarity, on the definitions, the benefit to the members, and what the scope of the project needs to be done. The end result is going to be the more detail, the more benefit, and the more it relates to COVID is, I'll say, it supports the funding.
And maybe if I can just add to that as well, the project description, I think we mentioned that project description box will expand as you're putting content in there in the application form. So you can even use the criteria that are mentioned, the COVID risk, the readiness, the human impact, I'm missing the fourth one, but those four things as almost headings for your application if you wish to do so. That will really help us to make the connection back to the criteria. And going back to something Paula shared earlier, if we can tie it to how it's going to safeguard your community against COVID and reduce the risk or mitigate the impacts of COVID, that's crucial. So just taking perimeter security as an example, you know, if you're speaking to the approach that your community is taking around that, if you can also speak to other functions that will perform, such as public awareness or a screening function or tracking contact information in case that's needed for tracing purposes at a later date. Those kinds of things are additional information that help us to really understand how the activity is linked to the risk and managing and mitigating those impacts that potentially could happen.
Thank you so much. The next question is regarding the isolation house, but I guess this could also be a number of other projects that is a very quick time frame for it to be completed by March 31st. So is there any give on the date for those type of projects, or any project that they can foresee taking longer than that?
Okay, I'll take a stab at this one. The terms and conditions of the funding are going to be released as fixed, flex, I believe fixed. And what that allows for is the work to be done until the end of March. If it does go beyond March 31st, though, there is an ability to bring unexpended funds from the current year into next year. But I would suggest one of the things that we may want to look at and emphasize is when the funds do come in, meeting the needs of the members or your members as quickly as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Vern. If I could ask Wendy Rogers to come on. She's indicated she wants to answer one of these questions live. And the question is, how do we distribute funds for off-reserve members? What is the criteria for that?
So I think there's a number of questions that I see in the chat, and certainly in our conversation with communities over the past months, there is lots of concern about how communities can support their off-reserve members. And so if some communities applied under the intake for urban and off-reserve, which happened a few months ago, and there was again this lots of requests to support off-reserve members. So the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. You can apply to support your off-reserve members. As Duncan said earlier, the intent of these funds are not to provide benefits to individuals, but we do recognize that there are some needs in areas of food security, in areas of accessing other supports where your off-reserve members may need to be supported. If you're thinking of that, I really encourage you to come. I think we're planning for next Thursday, and certainly we'll be emailing information on the date, but to attend the Urban and Off-Reserve webinar that we're having. And we're hoping that we can provide just a little bit more guidance around what kinds of supports you're more likely to be successful with in your application at that time. So hopefully that provides a little bit more clarity.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Yes, there are a number of other questions regarding the urban and off-reserve members, so thanks for that. Again, I just want to put it out to everybody. If you want to ask your question live, to use that blue raised hand option. All right, we have Terrence Thomas. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, good afternoon. My apologies for starting late. We had our kitchen being certified by a public inspector. We are the Prince Rupert Indigenous Housing Society. We're incorporated by the Kakatla Hereditary Table, and we serve the off-reserve community of Kakatla in Prince Rupert. And I was just calling, my concern is whether or not we qualify as the nonprofit as an applicant. Because ordinarily the funding applications will include like a nonprofit designation as opposed to how they're defined as an Indigenous organization. So just wanting clarification for that.
So maybe we can connect with you offline. I mean, the intention of the urban and the funding for urban and off-reserve Indigenous people is that's the population group that you're serving.
Sure.
But anyway, maybe if you can just in the chat or maybe to FNPSS afterwards, just forward us your email address, or you can contact me. I think my name's on the screen. It's wendy.rogers@canada.ca, and we can have a bit more detailed of a conversation about what you're thinking of and whether you qualify.
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terrence, for asking your question. Again, you can use that blue raise hand function if you want to ask a question live. There are a few more questions and just a few more minutes left in this webinar. The next question is, how should the reporting requirements be met? Would one schedule be enough for the COVID funding and expenses, including social assistance, or each COVID funding / expenditures be reported separately? Vern?
Okay, I'll take a stab at this one. When the reporting requirements come in, the requirement really is for a separate schedule for each of the projects. Now, with that said, there's a number of communities that do present their financial statements in such a manner where the same schedule can allow for expenditures and still differentiate which project they're being applied against. If that's the case, we've got absolutely no problem with it. But other than that, the easiest way to ensure that proposals are delivered, if there's any settling of accounts that's required, that expenditures are recognized against the appropriate project. Thank you.
And then maybe I'll just add that there were funds that were provided within the Indigenous Community Support Fund. Jody earlier spoke to the allocations, but separately there were also funds under other program areas. So income assistance was mentioned, and post-secondary and other areas as well. What I would say is for the reporting, and then I think Vern, you'd agree for the audit schedules, each of those separate funding streams should be kind of separated out within the audit. So the allocations under Indigenous Community Support Fund and the funding through the process could probably be represented together, but the income assistance and others should be represented separately.
Thank you both so much. The next question comes from the group chat. Can we use the funding for wage top-up for staff? COVID is taking a lot of extra work hours by our staff. What are the reporting requirements going to be? Will we need proof of purchase and payment receipts?
Sorry, that's probably my response, but apologies, Selena, can you repeat that?
Can we use the funding for wage top-up for our staff? COVID is taking a lot of extra work and hours by our staff. What are the reporting requirements going to be? Will we need proof of purchase and payment receipts?
Right, okay. This is where we get back to the intent of the fund. Now, when it was announced by the Prime Minister that there would be X amount of funding that would go out to what I'll call pandemic pay, the approach was to have the provinces determine who would be the essential employees. So when that came about, the province of BC highly, well, not highly immediately, they identified certain individuals, mostly in the support areas, social support areas, as the essential workers. That doesn't leave very much wiggle room for most of the band employees, though. I'll have to respond back just with the original intent of the funding.
Thank you.
Yeah. Selena, I'll just jump in and say that I think Vern's correct that we need to be very cautious about increasing wages for all workers that haven't been identified as some of those essential workers. So let's communicate with you directly about that proposal to make sure that because there's probably maybe some other ways that we can help support what it is you're trying to achieve. Are there others who want to weigh in?
Hi, Catherine.
Oh,
I'll turn it to you in a second, Emily. So it's Catherine Lapa. I'm happy to hear all the questions and level of participation. The pandemic top-up was, as was being described, reflected on reserve based on a provincial list of eligible occupations. And so, for instance, Delegated Aboriginal Agency and others. And there's also, as I answered in the chat, funding that's been provided to FNHA to reflect in the health-related professions the pandemic top-ups. So those are very specific occupations. I would just note that the Indigenous Community Support Fund does allow for First Nations to use that funding for incremental costs related to managing the pandemic. And I'll maybe just leave it at that because it can be open to interpretation how best that gets utilized. It can be additional positions, it can be shifting people from the band administration to other functions and so on. So it does provide some flexibility for First Nations to determine how best to resource and provide support during this period of time. But as I say, it's incremental costs. So it's not for band administration, but any incremental costs associated with managing the emergency.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Over to you, Emily, if you want to add to that.
I think Catherine did a great job. The only thing I would add to that is for FNHA specific spaces of eligibility, if it is for frontline healthcare workers, we can definitely accept those eligible costs through our COVID-19 needs and in coordination with our regional teams. So definitely reach in if it is for frontline care capacity and top-up pay.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you, our panelists and everybody for joining this webinar. As mentioned several times, there will be another one on Tuesday, November 10th at 1 p.m. So you should receive an invitation to that if you have not already. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to answer all of our questions, but ISC has promised, as always, to follow up with those individuals who submitted their questions individually following this webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the FMPSS YouTube channel with all of our other ISC town halls and our nation to nation sharing webinars too as well, if you'd like to check those out. That's it for us. So again, sorry we weren't able to answer all your questions, but we thank you for your time. Happy Friday, everyone. Stay healthy and safe out there and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.